Hello and welcome to this podcast on Disability Platform. Today with me I have Matthew Bellringer. And Matthew, over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, well, thank you very much for having me on the show, Arash. Really good to be on here. So, I am a neurodiversity and innovation specialist. I have a background in technology and psychology, primarily, with a lot of time in higher education in particular. Um, I work with neurodivergent people themselves about how they can support themselves better and their practice better. And I work with organizations that want to be better places for neurodivergent people. Alongside my own private practice, I also am chair of Neurodiverse IT within BCS, the Chartered Institute of IT. And I also run a community called Curious Being for unconventional people who want to make the world a better place. I'm also a late diagnosis autistic ADHD.
Wow, okay. A lot of expertise there, a lot of stuff to dive into, which I'm very excited about. So I was going to ask about your disability or condition, um, and sort of the background to it, how it impacts your life, both personal and professional, and also, how you identify with it, whether you call it disability, condition, etc. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a strange one because, like a lot of people who are late diagnosis, I mean, I've only actually known this about myself for a few years. So it's a very interesting thing to have experienced something as on the assumption that everyone experiences the world this way. And then to find out, oh no, all of these things that you found really difficult and struggled with all your life aren't because you're kind of morally failed in some way, but because you're autistic and autistic ADHD. And so I think there's one of the things that really comes up for me is I think I very much do think of these things as conditions in the sense that they are neutral outside of circumstance, or at least for
Sure.
me. Whereas it's the circumstances of life, the design of the world, the way that we think about things, the way that most people think about things, the way that things are set up to work, the expectations about what you should be good at and what you shouldn't be good at, and how those cluster together. Those are the things that I experience as disabling.
Okay, so very much on the social model of disability.
Largely, though, I mean, ultimately, I tend to think of a capability model of disability because there are certain things that, however much I can't, there are some things I'm just not any good at, and I would sometimes like to be able to do, and I'm pleased that other people can do them for me.
Yeah.
So really, I think it's a capability model underneath. I'm interested in this. I do have differences in capacity.
Mhm.
I have some great strengths and I have some great relative weaknesses. And so it's a very interesting thing. And how those constellate is one of the core things of being neurodivergent and experiencing the world differently. So it's a strange pattern. And in certain circumstances, I can fit a niche better than anyone else. I can be
Mhm.
particularly well adapted for a space. But quite a lot of experiences are the opposite, and that I don't fit, and that things are not for me and not something I can engage with. So but ultimately it's like if I had to do something, if I have to do something in a certain way or that I struggle with, it is a capability thing. It's just that I can't see the world that way or work in that way, sometimes at all.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the model that I actually prefer to use.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. I can understand that perspective, definitely. I mean, with myself being partially sighted and registered blind, I do find that there are things that I just cannot do, and that's not a social imposition or anything along those lines. For example, if I'm having to look at something, across the street, that's I just can't see that. It's that simple, and that's an inherent condition in myself. That's not society placing any sort of barrier on me. So I
Mm,
think it's interesting to know that there are different models where different disabled people with different conditions fit into or sort of align with more than others, which kind of makes disability such a wide spectrum and such a complex topic and no one size fits all.
Absolutely. And I think it gets even more complicated when we end up, well, we learn certain skills through practice to adapt, and then we develop those skills to a very high degree, much higher than perhaps most other people would, because we have to use them to get by
Yeah,
every day. And then, it's an interesting thing when we end up professionally relying on some aspect of them. And it's like, well, I've done this every day to get, from my entire life to get by. You've practiced this 9 to 5 since you were 21. It's like, it's not quite the same experience. And I think so we can develop these very deep skills in these adaptions
yeah,
as well. And that can also get wrapped up in all of this.
definitely. I think for me, it was a case of through school and university, um, because I went to school and sort of my first university experience of the three was at a time where there were no smartphones or great technology. I literally had a handheld telescope or a pair of binoculars to sort of look at the board.
Mm.
And so when you're sort of trying to keep up, I found that obviously, stuff was moving off the board or getting wiped off the chalkboard quicker than I could write it down. So it's very much a case of developing my memory to kind of combat that. And, well, everyone I know always says I've got a really good memory, but for me, it's more of a necessity and a skill that I've had to sort of rely on because I don't have the time to keep up, basically, in some scenarios.
And yeah, you haven't been able to check back. You've got like one chance at getting something.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I recognize that you said you're a late diagnosis ADHD, yeah? And
Mm.
did you sort of did you recognize the condition at an earlier stage pre-diagnosis, or was it only sort of brought to your attention and you were different before? I mean, I don't want to use the word different, but I'm trying to sort of figure out if
Mm.
when you were younger you had it, but you didn't realize, so you just carried on oblivious to it and just sort of wondered why you were different, or if
Largely,
yeah.
yes. I mean, I did have a dyslexia diagnosis as a child. And actually I did some, when I studied psychology, I did some research on the experiences of dyslexics. And I realized that my experience wasn't that there was a big group of dyslexics who didn't experience things at all like I did,
Okay.
which is an interesting thing in and of itself. And dyslexia and ADHD intersect quite considerably as well. And so, but it's phenomenologically quite different in terms of how we experience it internally. It's quite different to some other forms of dyslexia.
Okay.
So so understanding that and then kind of looking at that and finding actually what happened was I was at a conference talking about neurodiversity, an open space, a very kind of an unconference type thing with a bunch of people, and they all shared their lived experience, and I was like, that sounds familiar. That sounds familiar. That
Yeah.
sounds familiar. And it turned out they all had ADHD diagnoses.
Right. Okay.
And then I was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Sometimes you don't
Um,
realize it until someone else sort of points out, their lived experience, and then you sort of see the mirror image and you kind of wonder why you didn't pick up on it earlier.
I think this is the thing, and like we tend to assume until we get a really strong signal otherwise that our lived experience is the same as everyone else's.
Definitely. I mean, even myself, as someone who's registered blind, I just go about my day,
Mm.
and then it's only when someone's like, "Oh, look at that thing over there," and I'm like, "Oh, wait, yeah, I can't see." Okay, yeah, now I remember that I can't see. Like, I just, and it sounds stupid because I can't see all the time, but because I'm always like that, I just assume that that's just how everyone is.
And we see this with differences in color vision as well, in both like in hyper acuity and in reduced acuity. And like there's a thread on the inter like of on social media of a whole bunch of people showing the test for different types of color blindness, and people
Mhm.
arguing first of all that there's nothing there, and some of them being like, and then some of them arguing because the tests for multiple different types. It's got slightly ambiguous numbers in it.
Okay.
And so it's like if you see this number, then you're likely to have this. But if you see all of them, then and so and then there are people saying, well, no, it's clearly this number. And they're like, you should get tested. And I think that it's such a strange experience. And then there's apparently a small number. I think it's almost entirely women, if not entirely women, because I think it's associated with a double X chromosome
Okay.
of tetrachromy, which is to have 4 color receptors in your eye instead of the 3. So there are people out there who are seeing more color than everyone else
Wow.
as well.
Okay.
And like, how do we put ourselves in someone else's experience of all of
Yeah.
this? It's incredibly complicated. So completely.
So that brings me on to my next topic of discussion. So, can you tell me a bit about your professional life, your job role, how your condition or disability impacts what you do and how you do it, and just generally your industry and sort of maybe attitudes to disability and that you've experienced within it?
Yeah, so I'll start with the end, if that's all right, with the
Sure.
end of the question. Because I've done quite a lot of work in the IT profession, and in many ways, the IT profession has been quite a good place for neurodivergent people historically. You know,
Mhm.
there are neurodivergent people who have contributed a lot. However, there is still quite a lot of open stigma around the conditions and misunderstandings, and particularly professional misunderstandings around, you know, what people are capable of, what people aren't
Mhm.
capable of, and around the actual diagnoses themselves. So it's a strange, almost paradox within the profession that in some ways it's actually quite a good place for neurodivergent people, and there are quite a lot of neurodivergent people um, in the profession. And there are some real advantages to being neurodivergent in certain ways, and some organizations that are acutely aware of that, particularly the different perspective that you can often get from different conditions is incredibly valuable in things like cybersecurity and
Mhm.
testing, because you can think of cases that other people won't see and won't think
Mhm.
of. So and there are certain, you know, I know GCHQ, for example, recruit neurodivergent people explicitly because of that,
Okay.
for exactly that reason. However, yeah, so we do have this weird dichotomy, and there is significant prejudice in there. In terms of my own experiences, I think I stopped working for anyone else. I started working for myself before I knew I was an autistic ADHD.
Okay.
So it's an interesting question. What I did know is I found some aspects of work incredibly difficult, some aspects of work incredibly easy compared to my peers, both of which cause problems.
Okay.
Um, and that I was very capable, but also I found work very frustrating.
So
You know,
was your shift,
understanding the world.
sorry to
Sorry.
interrupt. So was your shift to working for yourself sort of fueled by the issues around your conditions?
In some significant way, yes. A lot like non-neurodivergent people, I'm prone to burnout.
Mhm.
Um, we tend to pick up this pattern of working very, very hard to solve a problem, because largely because often we're told we're lazy and stupid, and so you tend to internalize some of that, and so you tend to always push as a response.
Yeah.
Um, and so we tend to burn out in work rather than thinking, oh, maybe the work circumstances aren't appropriate. Um, so I had that experience. That was part of what led me to have to leave and say, okay, I need to work in my own way.
Okay.
And the explanation, the kind of exploration of what that actually was, led me to starting to finding the ADHD diagnosis.
Okay. So would you, because what I'm trying to do is make these discussions and these podcast interviews potentially into a resource for other disabled people, and especially younger disabled people who are looking forward to careers and their future adult life. Would you sort of have any tips or advice for entering the IT world as a disabled and neurodivergent individual?
Yes, definitely. I think one
Okay.
of the big ones would be to understand your strengths, and really find a workplace that allows you to focus on your strengths.
Mhm.
And that can be harder than it sounds, because often our strengths don't constellate in the same way as most other people's. So we can be strong in one area and relatively weak in another area, and then strong in a third area, when most people would expect you're strong in one area, so you should be strong in the second, but not the third. And so
Okay.
that clustering of skills can cause some challenges. So being aware of that, being aware of how you like to develop your own skills,
Mhm.
whether you're someone who is really good at exams and learning in a formal way, or whether
Mhm.
you're much more practical in terms of your learning. And often neurodivergent people have a strong preference for one way or the other, and how they like to acquire knowledge. So understanding how you like to do that and choosing a workplace that accepts that and supports that is really, really important. A lot of us will end up starting our own organizations in some way or another, particularly if you
Mhm.
have ADHD traits. Don't rule out doing your own thing. I think around something like 30 or 40% of entrepreneurs have ADHD, according to some of the
Wow.
studies I've
Okay.
seen. Um, Not just because it's easier for us to work for ourselves, but because there are actually some quite significant cognitive strengths that often come with ADHD that work well for entrepreneurs. The ability to, you know, do lots of different things and look at things from lots of different angles and cope
Yeah,
with
of course.
ambiguity and cope with complexity and just kind of throw yourself at things and try stuff out. That those often there are a lot of skills there that a lot of people with ADHD have. So thinking about the right circumstances that are going to fit what you're good at and also what you enjoy, because very often we learn that there's the stuff we're rewarded for, the stuff that we're told we're allowed to do, and then the stuff that we care about and we enjoy,
Yeah.
and that those two things are completely separate. And that
Unfortunately,
is that is a really hard thing to deal with in the longer run. I think that's a part of why we burn out.
definitely.
And so being able to like find something that sits at that intersection, and you won't get a perfect intersection straight away. You'll probably have to develop that. I think if you're neurotypical, able-bodied, cisgendered, white, male, if you're all of those
Yeah.
things, like all of the aspects of it, I think there's a reasonable chance. Oh yeah, and middle class,
Okay.
fairly
Yeah.
well off. There's a reasonable chance that the world will give you something where you'll get paid for something you enjoy doing to a reasonable degree. For
Okay.
most of the rest of us, we have to work out what that is and create that niche ourselves. And I think that work, knowing that, but also knowing that that's a possibility at all
Yeah.
is an important part of it. And when it's lacking, so being able to work towards that and
Mhm.
knowing that you're trying to align that intrinsic stuff that you really love and you care about and the stuff that you get paid for, and work out how to get more of that together over time is a really important aspect of this, whether you choose to do that working for yourself or for someone else.
Definitely. And I think I mean, that has to be the dream for everyone because,
Mm.
if we're going to have long-term, positive lives, basically, we need to find that intersection, as you say. So now my next question is going to be a sort of flip of the previous one. Do you have any tips or advice for non-disabled individuals or employers on how to potentially approach or deal with the issues of disability and neurodivergence, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could do a whole half hour on this alone, but perhaps the core message and the core thing that underpins a lot of this is understand your own experience of the world. Understand that you're coming from experiencing the world from a perspective. It's not that there's an alternative perspective and reality.
Yeah.
It's that there are lots of different perspectives on reality, lots of different valid ways of experiencing the world. And that what we're trying to do is create a breadth of connecting all of those up so that we can understand more and work more effectively at with a richer understanding rather than but that requires you to reflect on your own lived experience and understand your own experiencing of the world and how that differs, because that's often the very difficult thing is non-disabled people are treated as the default almost. I mean, and you could argue that's the definition, almost the definition of non-disabled.
Yeah.
There's a that's the because you are the default, you don't encounter the edges of this as
Yeah.
much,
Yeah.
but you still need to be able to engage. I think underpinning a really really good engagement is understanding what those aspects of your lived experience are and how they do play out and how they are supported by the world when perhaps other people's aren't. and also how you might fail when other people don't, how what you might not understand, what you might not perceive because you experience the world in that way, and therefore what other people might be able to contribute that you're not getting.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective and summary on everything. And that brings me to my final question for this podcast. And it's one that I think is incredibly important, but also incredibly personal to every disabled neurodivergent individual. And the backdrop, just to sort of put it in some context, is that I don't believe, and this is my personal belief, I don't believe that non-disabled individuals or organizations have any malice towards disabled people. I think the issues that are potentially experienced within society and employment, especially, are ones of, without sounding rude, ignorance in the context that they probably haven't come across certain disabilities, so they don't know how to deal with them. And it's, like I said, it's not a malicious intent. And so the point I want to discuss and get your view on is disclosure. And what are your views, your personal views? Because, like I said, it's personal to everyone. Some people disclose disability and neurodivergence, some people don't because they feel it has different impacts. What is your personal take on disclosure?
It's a very difficult question. I don't have a fixed answer.
That's
I
fine.
think it's there's but there's, and I agree, ignorance. I think there's also fear
Yeah,
around, and one of the interesting things is we get, as minoritized and marginalized people, we get used to handling ourselves and our own experiencing of the world, and we don't have the option to project it onto anyone else. So if we if we're like it, we tend to internalize it. It's all about us and our difference. The difficulty is the flip side of that is that we can get a lot of that fear and ignorance projected onto us.
yeah,
And whilst there might not be direct malice in it, it can sometimes amount to a very similar experience.
yeah.
There is a there was a piece of research published a few years ago now, but not that many years ago, I think it was 2019, talking to hiring managers, and they fully half of hiring managers expressed, as it was put in the survey, serious reservations about hiring a neurodivergent person.
Wow.
And this was for a professional white collar type jobs. So there is significant prejudice. I think organizations are afraid of not being able to accommodate and then getting into trouble.
Yeah,
I think there's a skills deficit there that they're afraid of. So in terms of sharing the condition, I tend not to say disclose because
okay,
disclose for me implies potentially something negative. So for me,
okay.
it's a neutral, trying for a neutral valence.
Yeah,
Um, so I tend to say share,
okay.
um, but um, but sharing the condition is a a personal and um, contextual choice. And it's something that we make all the time. It's one of the very interesting things um, about having a condition that people who aren't part of that group can't easily read from the outside. Which is an interesting experience because it's like I'm treated. If I do find myself in difficulty, particularly in certain like bureaucratic situations, I'm treated like an adult until I ask for an accommodation because I'm autistic. At which
Right.
point I'm treated like a child.
Wow. Okay.
And the infantilization, the fact that you're no, like this assumption that you don't have intellectual capacity or kind of ability to make so which and I know is likely to happen in certain, so I can say it and I know what that. But if I'm going to need to assert my position clearly, and I think that's going to be a thing, like I can't have both.
Yeah,
So it's knowing which one is going to be relevant. In organizations, I know some people, I think the majority of people now have started disclosing up front.
yeah.
And I know a lot of people who say, well, it's a filtering thing on my behalf. And I want to know up front if this place is a friendly place for neurodiversity. So if I tell
Understandable.
people and they're prejudiced against it, that's not going to be a good place for me to work anyway. So bullet dodged kind of thing. But I know other people who don't necessarily share it. I in my work I do kind of, it's public because of because I explicitly work in neurodiversity.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it would be if I wasn't,
Okay.
particularly as someone who works largely in contracts, and works for myself, because I don't need accommodations, because I set up the circumstances
Okay.
for that. So like my work is designed to support me because I'm working for myself and I can make all those decisions without getting someone else's approval.
Yeah.
And getting that approval is very often why we need to share the condition.
Yeah. I think it's such a difficult topic, and again, such a personal one, but also quite a few points that I picked up on that you were mentioning. So I mean, in some scenarios, if you have an obvious physical disability that presents straight away, then you don't really have much choice in the disclosure process. If you're in a
No.
wheelchair and you come in for an interview, people will see the wheelchair. If I carry my white cane into an interview, it's obviously, obvious straight away that I'm visually impaired. So there's that sort of, thing to consider there. But also the infantilization is very interesting, because I have had in the past interviews where I have a collapsible cane, so I've collapsed it, put it in my bag, and not taken it in, not mentioned anything at all, my CV and anything like that. And so I go in, the interview's going great, they're fascinated by what I'm saying and my past experience and my academics and all that. And then I mention, they're like, "Oh, is there anything else you'd like to say?" And then, yeah, by the way, I have a disability, I'm registered blind. And then it kind of goes dead. And the infantilization comes with, and I've had this question from partners at law firms saying to me, "Can you read?" And it's like, well, I'm probably not the first illiterate lawyer in the world. So, yes, obviously I can read. And then it's like, "Oh, can you use paper?" And it's these ridiculous questions. Um, but again, I think they're born out of ignorance and never having come across that condition before, not knowing, what it really means. But I just think that, those kind of questions are completely irrelevant and undermining. But I think it just demonstrates that people need to be educated a bit more, and not have the fear, that we've spoken about. Because I do think that fear potentially does cause a roadblock in communication and advancement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that broader, the skills thing of like, in some ways, it's like there's also a question of like, can you imagine a skilled lawyer who couldn't read paper, like read piece of paper, and it's like that's also a perfectly plausible situation. That's a very,
Yeah.
like, the idea that that would be too much of a problem for the organization is a weird,
Yeah.
that's the undercurrent almost. It's like, well, if you can't do this thing, then there's no way you can be good at the job,
Yeah.
is the thing behind the question.
Yeah.
And I think that's often the real problem, is this idea of like, of a bunch of skills that are somewhat related to the work, or the way that most people achieve whatever that they're, whatever the outputs are supposed to be, versus the way that, really thinking about outcomes and how we deliver those. And the idea that, oh, actually, well, I don't know, you can deliver the outcomes that we want multiple different ways, if we can think about it, if we can have a conversation about it. And it's this assumption that you can't, because you can't do it their way, you can't do it, is the most problematic of
Yeah.
all for me.
Definitely. And I think that's, again, hopefully something that this podcast, has lofty ambitions, but have some kind of social impact on all of these elements that we've spoken about today. Fingers crossed is all I can say.
No, it's
Well,
wonderful.
Matthew,
So thank you very much.
no, thank you for your time and your insights. It's been very interesting to speak to you. And all social media links and links to your website and everything will be tagged and available if anyone wants to get in touch with you to discuss anything. I think the more people we have sort of interacting, then hopefully the more we can spread the awareness and create a better society for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for both having me on the show and for doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Matthew. It's been a pleasure. Take care.